The Empire of Man over Nature, Chapter 3, Fermilab National Accelerator Laboratory. A New Frontier. In 1914, this man, Robert Wilson, was born in a small town in Wyoming, rather amusingly called Frontier. And 53 later, Wilson was appointed as the very first director of Fermilab National Accelerator Laboratory, which was created by the US Atomic Energy Commission in 1967. And although Fermilab was constructed in the suburbs of Chicago, here in Illinois, Wilson's obsession with frontier rhetoric, this idea that Fermilab was a pioneering new frontier, would basically come to define the lab both as a physical site but also as a research institution. And of course, a number of scholars have drawn attention to the total catastrophes of frontier rhetoric, particularly in relation to the Manifest Destiny programs of settler projects in North America. This is a famous, well-known representation. It's John Gast's painting of American Progress, really signifying these Manifest Destiny programs. But in this particular case, I'm really interested specifically in the relationship between Wilson, between Fermilab, ideas of frontier, and the history of Fermilab site itself. So when Wilson agreed to accept the directorship of America's brand new flagship physics laboratory, he did so pretty much on the sole condition that he would have total control over the creation of the facility and the site. And he declared the 6,800 acre site a tabula rasa, seeing in its open spaces what he called a blank canvas upon which to design the laboratory. And Morgan Stanley Livingston, this man who was an associate director of the new lab and a colleague of Wilson's, he also echoed this frontier rhetoric in his 1968 book, Particle Physics, The High Energy Frontier, in which he wrote, "There is in mankind a driving urge to explore the unknown. In past ages, much of this exploration was geographical, the search for new continents and new seas. In our generation, the most challenging frontiers lie in the search for new knowledge about nature and about man, and the most dramatic progress has been made on the frontiers of science. The frontier of high energy and the infinitesimally small is a challenge to the mind of men. If we can reach and cross this frontier, our generation will have furnished a significant milestone in human history." So, to create his new facility, Wilson and his colleagues, they drew not only on this rhetoric, this frontier rhetoric, but they also drew on frontier iconography. So, unlike the secrecy of places like Los Alamos Lab, for example, the kind of headquarters of the US Atomic Weapons Program, Wilson dreamt up this publicly accessible science city which wouldn't have any security fences, which instead would draw on, in Wilson's words, a romantic image of 19th century life on the original Midwestern prairie. And in order to realize these dreams, he set aside large areas of the site to plant up as these naturalistic prairie meadows in evocation of the mythology of the American heartland. So this is one of the meadows. This is in February, which is why it doesn't look spectacularly meadow-like. But there's huge areas of Fermilab site that are all planted up with this kind of restored prairie. Even more kind of amazingly, bizarrely perhaps, a herd of plains bison were introduced to the site in 1969. This is just some images of the bison. They kind of quickly became lab mascots. They're actually still there today, and every year when the first baby is born, it's like a big news frenzy. So as far as Wilson was concerned, Fermilab was a site where physicists were not only physicists, but they were pioneers. Part 2. Black Hawk and white settlers. So, as with so many others who have deployed the language of the tabula rasa, Wilson's fairly misguided ideas obliterate the site's history, and the fact that in 1967 Fermilab's land was neither a blank canvas nor a frontier. But more troublingly, I think this kind of rhetoric, it reproduces white supremacist language that dates, at least as far back to the 16th century. And Wilson's description of the Illinois farmland as a blank canvas echoes, for example, the kind of language that can be seen around the time of Elizabeth in England. And this is Richard Eden in a 1555 publication, Decades of the New World, where, for example, he compares the people of the New World to a piece of white paper unwritten upon, that you can paint and write what you like upon. So instead, I think it's important to acknowledge that the land on which Fermilab was built was not a tabula rasa, but it was the land with a troubled history. And this is in large part due to the fact that in the early 19th century it was a small part of a much larger area that was contested between the US government and a number of Native American tribes. So in 1804, you have the first of a series of 14 treaties that were signed. Treaty of St. Louis. I think that they're all kind of enveloped under this, or they come under this umbrella of the name, the Treaty of St. Louis. And it was between the territorial governor at the time, William Henry Harrison, and a group of Sauk and Meskwaki leaders, in which this large swathe of land between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River was supposedly sold for a little over $2,000 in goods and an ongoing annuity of $1,000 in goods. As part of these treaties, the tribes were allowed to continue to live on the ceded land until the US government sold it to colonists. And in 1928, this is the 1804 treaty. What I think is so kind of fascinating about it is you can see the tribe leaders signed his mark. They just signed their names with X's. So in 1928, the government finally started to survey the land and instructed the Sauks to vacate all settlements east of the Mississippi, including the site that now comprises Fermilab, which you can see. So this was land ceded in a later treaty. Fermilab is roughly here in this yellow area. And while most Sauks did relocate west of the Mississippi, a war captain who had fought against the US in the War of 1812, he bitterly opposed this forced removal and engaged in a series of conflicts with would-be settlers over the land. And this Captain Black Hawk, this is a depiction of him in his autobiography, he really deeply resented the treaty. And he felt that the tribe leaders who had signed here, they hadn't been authorized to do so in the first place. And so effectively the treaty was invalid as far as he was concerned. And in his autobiography, he wrote, I found by that treaty that all of the country east of the Mississippi was ceded to the United States for $1,000 a year. I will leave it to the people of the United States to say whether our nation was properly represented in this treaty or whether we received a fair compensation. So these series of bloody battles in which far more Native Americans died than militiamen, white soldiers, or regular soldiers culminated with the surrender of Black Hawk in 1832, August 1832. So Black Hawk and his 19 fellow leaders were incarcerated. And prior to their eventual release the following year, the prisoners were taken on a forced tour of a series of cities on the east coast of the US, Baltimore, Philly, New York City, where they appeared at dinners, plays, and military parades, drawing large crowds eager to see men who are supposedly living embodiments of the noble savage myth, as you can see depicted in this satirical print. And then and now, as the historian Carrie Trask has argued, white Americans absolved themselves of complicity in the dispossession of Native Americans by expressing their admiration or their sympathy for defeated Indians like Black Hawk. And this mythologizing of Black Hawk really continued with the kind of erection of plaques and memorials in his honor. So this is a Black Hawk Memorial in Illinois. And Trask writes that most of the reconstructed memory of the Black Hawk War has been designed to make white people feel good about themselves. And what's so interesting is that while the Black Hawk Wars were ongoing, before even the capture of Black Hawk, the very first white settler house had been constructed in the area that would later become the county, DuPage County, where Fermilab is situated. And this house is the Hobson House. It's constructed about 10 miles away from where Fermilab is today. And this was constructed in 1831. This is just some elevations of the house. And today the house is still there. And the same family who built the house also built a mill nearby. And the mill is not there, but the mill is now commemorated in this kind of bizarre and uniquely American way in a park called Pioneer Park. This is a memorial to these early settlers in the area. So, part 3. Weston, the town that was and then wasn't. On November 26, 1969, the 5 men who comprised the village board of the town of Weston, Illinois, officially voted their town out of existence. In so voting, the men effectively agreed that all the villagers would vacate their homes and farms and turn over the entirety of their land and property to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. So this bizarre act of self-sabotage was basically the culmination of the equally bizarre and quite fascinating history of the town of Weston and its predecessor called Westfield in the years following the Black Hawk Wars. So this whole county, DuPage County, was officially created in 1939, so that's just a few years after the creation of the first house, Hobson House, in 1931. So in 1840, the county's population was 3,500, and over the next 80 years, the area it basically stayed a relatively sparsely populated farming community, and by 1920 it had grown to only about 40,000 residents. But by the end of the Second World War, there was a massive exodus of people from the cities to the suburbs, and the county's population just jumped to about 300,000 by 1960, which in turn prompted a whole swathe of construction of new suburban developments for all these people to live in. So one of these developments was Westfield, which is the predecessor to Weston, the town that later voted itself out of existence. So this is Westfield. It was a relatively modest post-war subdivision built in the early 1960s, about 30 miles west of Chicago. And in January 1964, a very enterprising apartment building developer called William G. Riley unveiled his grand plans to transform Westfield into what he called the wondrous city of Weston, which this is kind of amazing Technicolor plan. It would have been basically an instant city of 50,000 people with more than 11,000 residences. It would have had man-made lakes, churches, polo fields. There was a single runway airport, and this kind of monstrous circular thing in the middle would have been the Rainbow Shopping Center, the world's largest shopping mall. Actually, if it had been built, it would have been still today the world's largest shopping mall. So what the residents didn't know at the time that Riley unveiled his grand scheme, there's a model of it, oops, wrong one, his grand scheme was that not only did Riley not have the money, he didn't have the financing to actually finish this project, but he was also $1 million in debt to the mob. And his story is quite interesting, but slightly tangential. So in any event, Riley's financial status didn't really matter because shortly after this grand unveiling of all of his preposterous plans, the DuPage County State Attorney sued on the basis that the village didn't actually have the legal power to annex this land for Riley's project in the first place. So a few months later, by April, the thing was completely dead in the water. And humanity's loss is greater than ours, said Riley at the time. So after the collapse of all of this, the town, the residents kind of rebounded. They were like, okay, well, we'll try and seek growth elsewhere. They elected a village president. The president, he canvassed the Supreme Court to try to regain their incorporation. He also, more importantly, submitted Weston, he nominated Weston as a possible location for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission's new national laboratory, because they were looking for a site at the time. So unbeknownst to the villagers, a delegation from the National Academy of Sciences, who were sort of outsourced to evaluate all the sites for the Atomic Energy Commission, they made a secret site inspection in 1965. Then they came back for a second inspection, and then they made a third and final visit the following year in 1966, which was greeted with a fanfare of color guards, fire trucks, and a band. And you can see this is the Atomic Energy Commission chairman, this is the governor of Illinois, and this is Weston's village president. So what is this? This is April 1966. So in December of the same year, the Atomic Energy Commission announced that from its short list of 6, Weston would be chosen as the site for the new lab, National Accelerator Lab. You can see here, this is a sign that was erected very shortly thereafter, and the village was completely elated. However, that elation was extremely short-lived, because villagers realized immediately thereafter that the Atomic Energy Commission's plans for the site, for the new lab, it incorporated the village of Weston into the site rather than locate the village just outside, which was what the town originally proposed. So some of the villagers thought, okay, maybe we'll just move our homes to a new site just outside the lab's boundaries. But the county, DuPage County, they said, no, we won't do that. We're not going to give you this adjacent plot of land. So some legal complications eventually meant that there was kind of compulsory purchase, and all of the residents were required to sell their homes, the farms, the lands to the state. And one of the residents, Robert Woolsfeld, who was a farmer who worked 138 acres of the best farmland in Illinois, was quite prosaic about it all. It's hard to leave, but I guess we have to make room for progress. And what's so interesting about all of this, I only made this connection quite recently, is that at the same time, the civil rights movement in Chicago, specifically the Chicago Freedom Movement, staged a protest, a tent-in the suburb immediately next to the Fermilab site, and in June 1967. So in December 66, you have the announcement. In June 1967, you have the protest. And this isn't a photo from the protest, the tent-in 1967. I couldn't actually find any photographs of it, but so the protest was very specifically a protest against the creation of Fermilab, and it was made in conjunction with the state of Illinois' ongoing refusal to pass a fair housing law, which would end racial housing discrimination following the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I have, like, you can see this is the kind of example of the sort of covenant that would have been, like, what does it say? Restrictions that said premises shall not be conveyed, leased to, or occupied by anyone not a Caucasian. So this is exactly the sort of thing that protesters were arguing needed to be put into law, so that these kind of racial discriminations couldn't be made on the basis, for any housing provision. So the specific protest, the tent-in, the organizers from the Chicago Freedom Movement, they were really trying to highlight this contradiction between a regulation in the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited any racial discrimination in projects that received federal funds. So their argument was that, okay, because Illinois has no Fair Housing Act, racial discrimination meant that no Black people would be able to live in any of these new homes around Fermilab, and therefore only white people would benefit. So because it was held in the suburbs, this is another Chicago Freedom Movement protest from 1966. This is in the center of Chicago. But because the protest was held in the suburbs, not close to the city centre, it received hardly any media attention. It wasn't particularly effective, and the state voted to allocate the federal funds to the lab, and the lab was approved. That said, the following year did see the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. This is it being signed by President Johnson, which prohibited racial discrimination. It was signed into law by President Johnson a week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So all of this is going on at the same time as actually the groundbreaking ceremony for Fermilab is taking place, which is quite amazing. So what's interesting is this is the groundbreaking in December 1968, and what that means is actually when Weston voted itself out of existence, the town council in 1969, it was basically just a formality because most of the residents had actually long since abandoned their homes and their farms. So it was just the kind of final formality in turning over all of the land to the state. And around the time of, I have some more pictures of the groundbreaking. Yeah, there was a band, and that's Wilson again. Yes, so around the time of the dissolution, when the village dissolved itself, there were around 450 people living in Weston, around 85 homes and 65 farms. This is just some of them on a map. They were all taken over by the new lab. And Wilson, he hired an engineering firm to kind of inventory and evaluate all of the existing properties. They were things like this. This is kind of one of the pioneer 19th century farmhouses. And so the inventory was partly to try to figure out, what could be used, what needed to be moved. A lot of the homes were left in their original position. So some of them are like where the bison live now. This home, I think, was actually moved, and it's a residence for visiting scientists. But so while a lot of the homes were left in their original position, many more were just picked up and moved, which I think these pictures are kind of, I love these sorts of ludicrous technical feats. So they've just picked them up, put them on flatbed trucks, and moved them to where they needed to be. And in the early years, a lot of the Weston homes served as offices before any of the offices were built. Today, a lot of these homes are still there. They're located on these kind of neat little rows. A lot of them are, as I mentioned, homes where visiting scientists and researchers lives. It's in an area of Fermilab that's colloquially referred to as the village. But what's kind of amazing, I didn't actually notice this when I was there on my long visit. All of the names, this seems very bizarre and quite inappropriate, all of the names of the streets in the village are named after Native American tribes and individuals. So you can see here again, there's a Sauk, there's Black Hawk Boulevard. So there's something quite weird about the fact that these houses built by 19th century white settler farmers that are now occupied by large numbers of visiting researchers are on streets named after Native American tribes that used to live on the land. Just as a final thought, not very far away from the village where all these houses are, this is also on Fermilab, is a pioneer cemetery that was sort of rediscovered in the early 1900s, and it's maintained by Fermilab as part of its agreement to have the land from the state. And this is on a part of the lab that's not really publicly accessible, so it's kind of tucked away. And Robert Wilson, he requested to be buried there. So the first director of Fermilab. So this is his grave, that's his wife's grave. So it's actually his ashes that are buried there. And it's quite fascinating to me that he was born in a town called Frontier, and he was really dedicated to these ideas of the frontier romanticism of this pioneering site, and he was really kind of committed to that to the end and insisted on being buried amongst, what he perceived as these other prairie pioneers. So he was really true to this kind of ridiculous idea till the end.